The atmosphere in the courthouse was thick with tension, not from the humidity outside, but from something deeper that had settled into the walls over decades. Everyone who walked through those massive oak doors knew the unspoken truth, how things worked in Judge Patricia Morgan's courtroom. She was a judge whose eyes rarely left the papers in front of her, and when they did, they cut through attorneys like a hot knife through butter. Judge Morgan had been on the bench for 22 years, long enough to leave behind a legacy, not the kind celebrated in law schools or carved in golden plaques, but a legacy whispered about in private corners of legal communities. Attorneys, especially those from minority backgrounds, had learned early on what to expect when their cases came before her. Her rulings often seemed to follow an unspoken pattern. No one could prove it, but everyone knew it. And today, that pattern was about to face a challenge. Daniel Roberts entered the courtroom, his polished shoes clicking on the marble floor. He had been here before, but today was different. He wasn't just any defense attorney. Today, he had a plan. Daniel was 45, a seasoned lawyer known for taking on the most difficult and seemingly hopeless cases. His reputation had spread well beyond the state of Alabama, and he had a knack for breaking down prosecutions piece by piece. But today there was something else at stake. This wasn't just about his client, Mark Davis, a man wrongfully accused of theft. This was much bigger. As he walked to the defense table, he could feel the weight of the room. It wasn't just about defending an innocent man. It was about exposing a broken system. It was about taking down Judge Morgan. Judge Morgan barely glanced at him as she began to speak, her voice cold and condescending. "Mr. Roberts, you're already pushing your luck in my courtroom. Don't waste my time today." Daniel kept his cool. "I'll try my best, Your Honor." Judge Morgan smirked, clearly unimpressed. "You should. I have a full docket, and I don't have time for theatrics." The trial began, but it was far from a fair process. Every objection Daniel raised was quickly dismissed, almost as if Judge Morgan had already made her mind up. The prosecution, represented by a young and ambitious assistant district attorney named Philip Brooks, appeared to be completely in sync with the judge. Their tactics synchronized like a well-rehearsed performance. Daniel had seen it before, the system working against him, against his client. But this time, there was something different about it. There was an ugliness in the way Judge Morgan treated him, a raw contempt that she didn't even bother to hide. He knew that this wasn't just about the case anymore. It was about something far deeper. His client, Mark Davis, sat quietly beside him, his shoulders hunched as if he had already resigned himself to the system's cruelty. Mark was a man wrongfully accused of stealing, a man who had spent too much of his life caught in the system's gears, and now he was facing this, a courtroom where everything seemed rigged from the start. Daniel leaned in and whispered to Mark, "Don't worry, we'll get through this." His voice was calm, though inside his mind was racing. He had a plan, but it was going to take patience. Patience that had been honed through years of dealing with the injustices of the system. Judge Morgan continued her biased rulings, shutting down every attempt Daniel made to challenge the evidence. Each time he stood up to speak, she quickly overruled him, her tone condescending, as if his words were of no consequence. The jury was beginning to notice, and even a few of the white jurors seemed uncomfortable with the way things were unfolding. It wasn't just bias, it was something deeper, something more dangerous. Daniel had been in hostile courtrooms before, but this was different. This wasn't just a judge who had a personal vendetta. This was a woman who had built her career on cruelty and corruption. "Mr. Roberts," Judge Morgan said, her voice dripping with disdain, "if you raise one more objection, I'll have you removed from this courtroom." Daniel kept his cool. He knew this was just another attempt to provoke him, to make him react. He had to stay calm, had to keep pushing forward, because he knew that sooner or later his moment would come. The trial dragged on with Daniel's objections routinely ignored. But then he saw it, a slip-up from the prosecution, a piece of evidence that had not been disclosed in discovery. He saw the opportunity and pounced. "Your Honor," Daniel said, his voice steady, "the prosecution just introduced evidence that was not disclosed in discovery." "I move for an immediate mistrial." Judge Morgan leaned back in her chair, adjusting her glasses. "Denied," she said, with a hint of amusement in her voice. Daniel didn't flinch. He had been prepared for this. Your Honor, this is a clear violation of Brady v. Maryland, he said, his tone unyielding. I move for a mistrial again. For the first time, Judge Morgan's face twitched. She looked at him, her eyes narrowing. Mr. Roberts, you're walking a very fine line here. The tension in the courtroom was palpable. Every eye was on Daniel, waiting for his next move. The jury was divided. Some were clearly sympathetic to him, while others, influenced by the constant barrage of the prosecution's arguments, seemed to be swayed. Daniel took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. The weight of the case, the corruption, the injustice of it all, was almost unbearable. But he couldn't let it show. He had to keep going. For Mark, for himself, and for every other person who had ever been let down by the system. Your Honor, Daniel said, standing tall and addressing Judge Morgan directly, the law is clear, and your rulings have been anything but impartial. I demand that this trial be declared a mistrial based on your blatant bias. The courtroom fell silent. The judge's face darkened, and for a moment, it seemed like the air itself had thickened. The jurors exchanged nervous glances. This was a turning point, but it was unclear which way it would go. Judge Morgan slammed her gavel down, the sharp sound echoing through the room. Motion denied. You will not disrupt this court further, Mr. Roberts. Daniel's heart raced, but he didn't back down. This is exactly the kind of injustice that we've seen so many times before, and you, Judge Morgan, are part of the problem. The jury reacted this time. Murmurs spread throughout the room, and a few heads turned in surprise. It was as if Daniel's words had finally struck a chord with them. They could see through the corruption now, but Judge Morgan wasn't having it. Enough, she snapped. You're testing my patience, Mr. Roberts. I'm warning you. Daniel held his ground. He wasn't going to let fear control him. Not now. Not when Mark's future was on the line. You can threaten me all you want, but the truth is, you're just trying to cover up your own corruption. I'm not going to back down. For a moment, it looked like they were at a stalemate. Then, unexpectedly, a voice from the back of the courtroom interrupted. Objection, said a new figure, a defense attorney named Laura Thomas, who had been sitting quietly in the back. Laura had been brought in last minute, a legal expert with a reputation for handling difficult cases like this. Judge Morgan shot her an icy look. And who might you be? I'm Laura Thomas, she said confidently, standing up. I represent Mr. Davis now, and I request that the trial be suspended until further review of the evidence and your conduct. The courtroom buzzed with a new energy. Laura was a wild card, and the jury seemed to take notice. This wasn't just a battle between one attorney and one judge anymore. Now it was a fight for justice, and Daniel could feel it in the air. Judge Morgan's eyes narrowed, but Laura stood firm. There was no turning back now. The room was thick with anticipation as everyone waited to see how this would play out. The balance of power in the courtroom had shifted, and it was clear that Daniel's persistence was starting to pay off. You want to suspend the trial? Judge Morgan scoffed. On what grounds, Miss Thomas? Laura remained calm. On the grounds of improper conduct, Your Honor. The evidence in this case has been tampered with, and there are serious concerns about the integrity of the trial. We cannot continue under these circumstances. The room fell into an uneasy silence. Daniel looked at Laura with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Could this be the break they had been waiting for? Judge Morgan was visibly rattled, but she regained her composure quickly. I will consider your request, she said, though the tone of her voice made it clear that she wasn't pleased. But this trial will proceed unless proven otherwise. As the judge deliberated, Daniel couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like they had a chance. The jury was growing restless. They exchanged whispers, clearly shaken by the tension in the room. But one thing was clear. The scales of justice were starting to tip. Finally, Judge Morgan spoke again. This trial will continue as scheduled, she declared, her voice ringing out with authority. But Ms. Thomas, I expect you to refrain from further disruptions. Laura nodded respectfully, not backing down. Understood, Your Honor. As the judge prepared to continue, Daniel exchanged a look with Laura. She gave him a slight nod, a silent signal that the battle was far from over. There was still hope. The courtroom was on edge as the trial resumed. The stakes had never been higher. Daniel knew that every word, every piece of evidence, and every gesture would now be scrutinized more closely than ever. The next move would decide everything. As the prosecution began to present their case, Daniel could feel the weight of the trial bearing down on him. But he wasn't going to back down. He would fight not just for Mark, but for justice. He turned to Laura, who was already preparing to counter the prosecution's arguments. This was their moment, and together they would make sure that the truth would come out, no matter the cost. The tension in the room was palpable as the trial resumed. Every eye was on Daniel as he stood, ready to fight for the justice his client deserved. The courtroom had been turned into a battleground, and there was no turning back now. As the prosecution presented their case, Daniel meticulously listened, catching every flaw, every inconsistency. He knew that he would have to be precise, that he would have to prove the system had failed his client. "Objection, Your Honor," Daniel called out, his voice steady but firm. "The evidence presented here is circumstantial and does not prove beyond a reasonable doubt that my client was involved in this crime." The judge raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting such a bold challenge, but she nodded, signaling for the prosecution to respond. "Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself," the prosecutor said confidently, clearly trying to regain control. The defendant was seen at the scene, and the witness identified him. Daniel stepped forward, addressing both the judge and the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, what you just heard is not the whole story. The witness was unsure, and we know that eyewitness testimony can be unreliable. I urge you to consider the facts, not just the assumptions." The jury shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly affected by Daniel's words. The tension in the room was almost unbearable. Judge Morgan, who had been silent up until now, finally spoke. "Mr. Hayes, I suggest you stick to the evidence." Daniel didn't flinch. "I am, Your Honor, and I believe the evidence speaks in favor of my client's innocence." The judge, clearly growing impatient, motioned for the prosecutor to continue. "Proceed with your argument," she ordered. Daniel stood his ground, but in his mind the battle was far from over. The pressure was mounting, but he was determined to win, not just for his client, but for all those who had been wronged by the system. The prosecution continued, but Daniel knew he had already planted the seed of doubt. The truth was starting to surface, and there was no way to put it back in the box. As the trial dragged on, Daniel's strategy began to take effect. The prosecution faltered under the weight of their own arguments, and even the judge's bias couldn't shield them. The tide was turning. The final witness was called, a former employee who had worked for the defendant for years. He was nervous, but Daniel saw an opportunity. This could be the break they needed. Daniel approached the witness stand with his usual calm demeanor. He knew that this testimony could change everything. "Mr. Davis, you worked with my client for over 10 years. Can you tell us about the nature of your relationship?" Daniel asked, his voice steady. The witness hesitated but then nodded. "We were close. I know he didn't commit this crime." Daniel's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. He turned to the jury, his voice clear and strong. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you've heard the evidence. You've seen the inconsistencies. Now I ask you to look at the man in front of you, not as a defendant, but as a human being. This is a man who has been wronged, a man who deserves his day in court." The courtroom was silent, every eye focused on Daniel. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for a moment it seemed as if time had slowed. The jury appeared deep in thought, processing everything they had heard. Daniel took a breath, not to break the silence, but to gather his thoughts before making his final move. This was the moment that would define the rest of the trial, and perhaps his career. "Members of the jury," Daniel continued, his voice steady and unwavering, "you have a duty to decide the truth, not based on assumptions, but on the facts. The truth is clear. My client is innocent, and I am confident that once you consider all the evidence presented, you will see that as well." The room remained still, the only sound now the ticking of the clock. Daniel had made his case, and now it was up to the jury. The judge leaned forward, looking down at the defendant with a cold expression. "You may step down, Mr. Hayes. We will now proceed with closing arguments." Daniel nodded, stepping back with confidence. but his mind was racing. He had done everything he could to expose the flaws in the prosecution's case, but he couldn't shake the feeling that the final decision was still up in the air. The prosecutor stood, ready for the final argument. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we have shown beyond a doubt that the defendant is guilty. The evidence is clear. The witnesses are credible. You have heard everything you need to make your decision. But Daniel knew better. He had already seen through the cracks in the prosecution's case. The pressure was immense, but he wasn't about to let his client be a victim of a system that had failed them both. The prosecutor's words echoed in the courtroom, but Daniel's mind was already on the next phase, waiting for the jury's decision. The hours dragged on as the jury deliberated. The clock ticked louder with every passing minute. It felt like an eternity. Finally, the door opened and the jury filed back into the room. The foreman stood and cleared his throat, ready to announce their verdict. We, the jury, find the defendant, Mr. Hayes, not guilty. A wave of relief washed over Daniel. It was done. His client was free. The fight was over, but the victory was sweet. He turned to his client, who was on the verge of tears. You're free, Daniel said simply, but the emotion in his voice said everything. The courtroom erupted in applause. The judge banged her gavel, calling for order, but it was clear that this was a moment of triumph. Daniel had done it. The battle was won, but the war for justice was far from over. Daniel knew that his work was just beginning, but for today at least, he had given his client the freedom they deserved. Daniel walked out of the courthouse, the weight of the day finally lifting from his shoulders. The bright sunlight hit his face, but he didn't mind. He had fought for justice, and today justice had won. His client, Michael Hayes, walked beside him, his eyes filled with gratitude. Thank you, Daniel. I don't know what I would have done without you. Daniel smiled, though it was a small smile. It was my job, Michael. I just did what was right. The two men walked together, knowing that they had achieved something monumental, but the weight of what had happened in that courtroom still lingered in Daniel's mind. As they reached the car, Daniel paused for a moment, his gaze distant. He had won the case, but the battle for justice was far from over. The system was flawed, and he knew there would be more fights ahead. Michael, Daniel said, breaking the silence, this case, it's just one chapter. There's a lot more to do. Michael looked at him, still in disbelief. But what about now? What about today? Daniel turned to face him, his expression serious. Today, we celebrate, but tomorrow we keep fighting. There are many more people out there who need us. Michael nodded, understanding. You're right. The fight never ends. As they got into the car, Daniel's thoughts were already turning to the future. There would be other cases, other injustices to fight, and the road ahead would be long. But for today, he had made a difference, and that was enough. He drove off, the city skyline fading in the rearview mirror. There was a long road ahead, but Daniel was ready for whatever came next. Weeks passed, and Daniel found himself back in the courtroom, this time for another case. He had won the battle, but the war for justice continued. This new case was different, more complex, but Daniel felt a sense of purpose. He had learned from his previous case, and he was determined not to let the system fail again. As he prepared for the next battle, Daniel thought back to Michael's case. The victory was sweet, but it was only a small step in the fight for justice. He knew that every case mattered. Every person who came to him for help deserved a fair shot at justice, and that was what he would continue to fight for. The fight was far from over, but Daniel was not afraid. He had already proven that one person could make a difference, and he wasn't about to stop now.